Wow.
Context around that. The vote was around putting Montenegro into NATO. What's your reaction to Senator McCain's characterization of your objection?
Well, I think he makes a really, really strong case, for term limits. I think maybe he's past his prime. I think maybe he's gotten a little bit unhinged. I do think that when we talk about NATO, there can be a rational discussion about the pros and cons of expanding it. We currently have troops, combat troops, in about 6 nations. We have troops actively just stationed in probably a couple dozen others. We have a $20 trillion debt. And one of my favorite articles of the last couple of years was one that talked about the angry McCains. And if we put active troops and got involved in combat where McCain wants us to be, they put a little angry McCain on the globe, on the map, and it's virtually everywhere. So his foreign policy is something that would greatly endanger the United States, greatly overextend us, and there has to be the thought whether or not it's in our national interest to pledge to get involved in war if Montenegro has an altercation with anyone. There's also another argument, is that when you ask the people of Montenegro, only about 40% or slightly less are actually in favor of this. They are close to Russia. They're close to being sort of like Ukraine in the transition from Europe to Asia. Perhaps it would be good to be like Switzerland and be more neutral and trade with both. So there's a lot of considerations, but to call someone somehow an enemy of the state or a traitor might be considered by most reasonable people to be a little over the top.
Well, Senator, you just called John McCain unhinged. You said he was past his prime. Why do you think so many other senators have voted in favor of this measure if it's so crazy?
I think that there is a bipartisan consensus that's incorrect that we should have the whole world in NATO. For example, if we had Ukraine and Georgia in NATO, and this is something McCain and the other neocons have advocated for, we would be at war now. Because Russia has invaded both of them. And so I think having former satellites or former parts of the Soviet Union in NATO is very provocative, and you have to decide in advance whether you're ready to go to war. If you guys are ready to send 1 million troops into Ukraine and fight World War III, you're going to do it without my support, because I think that's a really foolish notion.
Do you think, Senator, places like Albania and Croatia then should have been allowed into NATO in 2009?
I think it's a real debate how big NATO should be and whether or not it's been more provocative than good. And there's also the debate that the president brought up throughout the campaign, and that is we seem to be paying for all of it. Whenever there's a war fought, our soldiers fight it and our dollars pay for it. And so the 45 soldiers that Montenegro has, I think, are hard an asset to our national security, and really our decisions need to be about our national security, and so I just don't think it enhances our national security to have Montenegro part of NATO.
Rick Stengel, having worked in the State Department all these years under the Obama administration, what do you make of NATO expansion for a country like Montenegro?
Yeah, I would ask the senator, what countries would you actually take out of NATO that NATO expanded? And I think it's a perfectly valid argument to make to say that NATO has expanded too much. But I mean, maybe there's a second tier in NATO. I'd be curious to see how you would do it differently.
I guess I would reverse the argument and ask you the question, do you think Ukraine and Georgia being in NATO are good for our national defense? I think it's a ridiculous notion. And the same people that want Montenegro, they also want Ukraine and Georgia. And they better think it through and ask the American people. And I guarantee if you ask the American people, are you ready to march tomorrow to support Montenegro? Are you ready to march tomorrow? Are you ready to send your dollars? Because none of these nations actually pay even close to their 2%. Are you ready to fight and die for Montenegro, Ukraine, Georgia? I think the people I think if we're asked for that question, I think you'd find that many more would side with me than with the so-called bipartisan consensus up here that has spent us into oblivion and obligated us to fight everyone else's war.
Senator, I'd say there's a little bit of a false choice there in terms of comparing Montenegro to Ukraine. Ukraine is a country the size of France in the middle of Europe. There are many, many Ukrainian Americans. There are people who would actually fight and die for Ukraine in America, but might not do so for Montenegro.
And I would not prevent anybody from volunteering to fight in a war in Ukraine. I would not conscript or send our soldiers there. I don't think it's in U.S. national interest to have our soldiers in there and say that this is our war. And yes, the same people who want Montenegro Not the same battle, but it's the same people, and we have not yet had the battle. We've had some battles, and probably I was the one who unilaterally stopped them from rushing Georgia in a couple years ago, and I look at that as that maybe I've saved thousands of Americans' lives.
Hi, this is Sharon reporting from Bad News Media. Thanks for subscribing to our channel and giving us a thumbs up. We really appreciate your support. Please feel free to leave us a comment and share this video with your friends. Thank you.